Up until now, I've been discussing the biological and psychological effects of cannabis. Now I'd like to shift our attention to some of the negative health effects of cannabis and shine light on some of the individuals or groups out there that need to be especially wary of and probably avoid cannabis use entirely, including ingestion of cannabis by way of edible. And I frame things that way because I think there is an increasingly large number of people out there that appreciate that smoking tobacco or smoking cannabis, vaping tobacco, yes, vaping tobacco or vaping cannabis, each and all have negative health consequences on the lungs and on the so-called endothelial cells of the body, the cells that make up the vasculature, the capillaries and blood vessels. If you don't already know this, I'll make it very clear and I'll make it very brief. Whether or not you smoke or vape tobacco or cannabis, you are severely impairing the function of endothelial cells that make up the capillaries and blood vessels of your brain and body. And that is known to decrease cognitive capacity over time, increase probability of strokes, severely impact lung function, and also lead to things like peripheral neuropathies. It leads to sexual dysfunction because of lack of blood flow to the genitals, can lead to other aspects of reproductive damage, including to the ovaries and testes. Essentially, there is no other way to state it except that smoking and vaping have negative health consequences that are independent of the substances that people are trying to get into their bloodstream by smoking or vaping. So people smoke and vape tobacco and people smoke and vape cannabis. And in both cases, if we just set aside the direct effects of tobacco and the direct effects of cannabis, we can confidently say that the process of smoking, of inhaling smoke into the lungs, and yes, also vaping, bringing the chemicals that transport nicotine, or in this case, cannabis, into the lungs by way of vaping, are both severely detrimental to endothelial cells. I think a few years ago when vaping wasn't as prominent, there was this question and this idea that maybe vaping was going to be far healthier or at least not as bad as smoking. But now we can see a huge number of negative health effects of vaping, some of which are distinct from the effects of smoking. So if you'd like more information on smoking versus vaping, please see the episode that I did on nicotine. We will also do an entire episode all about vaping in the future. But there's really no way to slice it and dice it or candy coat it. The fact of the matter is that smoking has clear and severe negative health consequences, regardless of whether or not you're smoking tobacco or cannabis, THC. And vaping has negative health consequences, whether or not you're using the vape to bring in nicotine or THC or some combination of THC and CBD. That's simply the way it is. With that said, now I'd like to focus our attention on the direct effects that cannabis has, either by way of THC action or by way of CBD action, in terms of positive or negative health effects on the brain and body. And we're going to explore that first as a function of age. And the reason we're going to do that is related to a fact that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, which is that the CB1 and the CB2 receptors, the two receptors for cannabis, to which THC and CBD and CBN and all other psychoactive compounds of cannabis bind to have their actions, are present throughout development. Believe it or not, they are present very soon after conception, and the CB1 and CB2 receptors actually play a critical role in the development of the fetus. Now, you might wonder why that is, because, of course, the developing fetus doesn't necessarily expect to see cannabis or to be exposed to cannabis and THC and CBD. But as you recall, endogenous cannabinoids are present in the adult brain and body, and endogenous cannabinoids, it turns out, are also present in the developing fetus. In fact, endogenous cannabinoids are present at much greater levels in the developing fetus than they are after a child is born. And levels of endogenous cannabinoids actually go down across development. I find this really interesting. What this means is that endogenous cannabinoids and activation of the CB1 and CB2 receptors are an integral part of neural development. And this is going to become especially relevant in considering whether or not pregnant mothers should or should not use cannabis or CBD. And it also points to some very interesting biology in terms of how the brain develops and how the body develops. Now, the development of the brain and nervous system and body is a fascinating and vast literature, certainly far too vast to cover in today's episode, especially at this late hour, as it were. But we will have a future episode all about brain development. In terms of the effects of cannabis, it's sufficient to say that cannabinoid receptors are present and active in the developing fetus. They are present and active in the newborn. They are present and active in adolescence. And across that time, from conception until adolescence, endogenous cannabinoids are mainly responsible for the actions of those cannabinoid receptors. During that time, the cannabinoid receptors are having very specific effects that are distinct from their effects later in life. And those effects can largely be explained in terms of neural development. Again, we don't have time for an entire lecture on this now, but during development, your body was a collection of a bunch of cells. It's actually called a blastula, which means a ball of cells. And then those cells actually have to grow out connections and duplicate themselves. And this is a very interesting process by which neurons initially are situated far apart, and then they grow out connections and make contacts with one another. They remove certain connections depending on what kind of life events you're exposed to. If you have a wonderful event early in life or a traumatic early life, those connections change, etc. The important point for today's discussion is that the CB1 receptor in particular is expressed on every neuron in the developing brain and has been shown to be important for every aspect of neural development, from the proliferation of cells, meaning getting enough cells to create a brain, to the outgrowth of the so-called axons, the little wires that connect up neurons with one another, to the steering, the direction that which those axons go in development, which is essential, and even so far as to explain the connections that form between neurons, the so-called synapses, and then how those synapses work. So the basic statement here is that endogenous cannabinoids and CB1 receptor activation are critical for every aspect of brain wiring and development. With that in mind, the statement I'm about to make is absolutely terrifying, at least to me, and frankly, it should be terrifying to you as well. And the statement is, the current statistics on cannabis use in pregnant mothers is absolutely shocking. The most recent survey of pregnant mothers in the United States show that 15% of pregnant mothers report using cannabis in some form or another, either smoking it or more likely ingestion of an edible, because they are aware of the negative effects of smoking on the developing fetus, ingestion of an edible to increase THC and or CBD during pregnancy, which to me, I have to say, as a developmental neurobiologist, is frankly, it's scary. It's absolutely scary because that CB1 receptor is not just a minor player in neural development. It is absolutely central to every critical aspect of brain wiring and development. Now, the long-term implications or even the short-term implications of this 15% of mothers self-reporting the use of cannabis at some point during pregnancy are not yet known. This is, as we would say, it's an experiment that's ongoing. But I'd be remiss if I didn't point out these data and just implore you, please, 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 if you are pregnant or considering getting pregnant, you're a cannabis user, whether or not you're using edibles, if you're a CBD user, please do whatever is necessary to not ingest cannabis or smoke cannabis or ingest CBD during pregnancy. Now, there may be certain clinical indications by which your physician and your OBGYN and the pediatrician that will eventually be the pediatrician for your child will prescribe CBD, although it's hard to imagine what those are. I contacted a number of different pediatricians and OBGYNs, and not a single one said they would ever suggest and in fact would strongly discourage their patients from using cannabis during pregnancy. But I think that the advent of edible forms of cannabis and the combination of THC and CBD in certain products, and the fact that most people view CBD as safer because it does not include does not have, I should say, the psychoactive effects that THC does, has led to a situation where you have 15% of pregnant mothers using cannabis at some point during pregnancy, and maybe even frequently throughout pregnancy. And the effects on the developing fetus are completely unknown. But recall that cannabis and THC and CBD outcompete, meaning they park in the receptor for endogenous cannabinoids and prevent endogenous cannabinoids from having their normal level and pattern of action. So this is absolutely critical. I cannot encourage you enough, or rather I should say I cannot discourage enough the use of cannabis and any related compounds in cannabis, edible or smoked, certainly not smoked, but even edible during pregnancy. And certainly in breastfeeding, lactating mothers, the same is also true. Recall that cannabis and THC and CBD are incredibly lipophilic. They are fat soluble and they get into cells very readily, and they cross the blood-brain barrier. They cross the blood-placental barrier. So when I encountered this statistic, I had to kind of wipe my eyes a few times. I could not believe it. And yet I cross-checked that number with a few other studies. A few others have come in a little bit lower at, somewhere like 13 to 14%, and a few have come in a little bit higher, but the average of 15% is both striking and shocking. So I don't know how to make the message more clear. I hope that is clear. Please do not use any cannabis, THC, or related things, including CBD, smoked or edible, if you're pregnant, lactating, etc. Now we are at the point where we need to consider some of the negative health effects of cannabis that have been well documented in peer-reviewed studies. And before I do this, I want to return to a point that I made earlier, which is that nothing I am about to say relates directly to issues of legality. If we consider alcohol, for instance, alcohol is legal in most areas of the world. It's certainly legal in the U.S., and yet there's an age limit for its use. Typically, it's not available to people until they're 21 or older. It's not to say that certain people don't use it before age 21, but it's not legal. It is illegal to buy or possess alcohol, consume alcohol before age 21. And I think with good reason, because the brain is still developing. Likewise, we can have a informed discussion about cannabis and its various components that can fully acknowledge the reality, which is that one of the major harms of cannabis in the past has been the legal ramifications of cannabis being illegal. I think that's a statement that is no longer controversial. And this is not a discussion about legalization or non-legalization. If you look to the scientific literature, the epidemiological literature, there are wonderful data out of Carleton University and elsewhere in Canada showing that, many of the negative effects of marijuana and THC are due to the criminal justice system itself. That is the creation of illicit drug businesses, the creation of organized crime, the creation of a number of different features related to the illegality of cannabis. And again, this isn't the topic of today's episode, but that should be acknowledged. And at the same time, we need to acknowledge that when a compound, a drug, or whatever you want to call it, becomes legal, there's a tendency to assume that it's safe and safe for everybody. And with respect to cannabis and THC, and perhaps even CBD, but certainly for THC and cannabis that's smoked or vaped or consumed in edible form, that is simply not the case. There are clear data pointing to negative health effects of cannabis use and THC use, which again is not to say that there are not positive effects on mood, anxiety, pain relief, etc. Those are out there and they exist, and we will mention some of those, of course, and we've talked about some of those, creativity, for instance, etc. But if we do not acknowledge the negative health effects that are documented in the literature, then we are overlooking some very important data, especially as it relates to the development of psychosis in certain individuals.